Good morning to everyone that is in local China time. I'm your moderator for today, Sunny Lou Williams, and I'm excited to welcome everyone back to day 2 of the AODN Summit 2020. What a riveting day we had yesterday for day 1, when the opening ceremony we heard from multiple organizational development networks, Asia, China, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Australia, and had such excellent reviews from leadership on OD networks across the world on the latest and initiatives of OD. Following that, we had an excellent plenary session facilitated by Roland Sullivan with inputs and key insights from our OD leadership. Our interactive session with Dr. William Rothwell looked at the key tenets of how OD transformation from an HR perspective, the do's and don'ts, the details behind what that looks like, and essentially a riveting how-to guide of organizational change. When we came back, we heard from Dr. Suprince Ma of her specific experience in Asia in integrating strategic HR management and the organizational development principles that have led her as a HR manager and executive leader into multiple organizations across the world. We had a fascinating track 1, 2, 3, and 4 in our open space session in the afternoon, covering key topics like exploring the dynamics of change, transforming organizations in Asia, creating a new OD and expanding learning in Asia, and also developing leadership in Asia that was presented by our doctoral students in looking at re-envisioning the world through the lens of OD. Excellent sessions yesterday in day 1 on Friday, December 11th, all presiding upon local China time. If you missed any of those sessions, a playback will be available on the AODN.org website 2 weeks following the conference, with ability to review publications and also video-based access of our presenting speakers. Now, to engage us on day 2, I know that there was quite a few learning curves yesterday on utilizing the GoToWebinar platform. So again, today, I'd like to refresh everyone on utilizing the system. We would like everyone to utilize the question pane, which is on your technology platform, to ask questions rather of our speakers and presenters as they are sharing content. We also have other interactive mediums that will be deployed in today's day 2, following the tracks and also the plenary and other engaging topics that will be driven by other speakers throughout the day. GoToWebinar from a interaction perspective is limited as we look at the lecture capability of each presenter. The primary interaction is going to be through the question pane, and then as presenters welcome the audience to participate, we then can ask folks to globally unmute and also provide access to their webcam to have further conversation. Our sessions have been quite large, upwards of 70 persons. So as we go through each of the sessions, it will be really dependent upon the presenter's preference to globally unmute and globally access cameras. Today, our agenda will be an interactive session with Dr. Matt Minahan on the Global OD Competency Framework from 9 to 10:15 Global China time, and then a tea break followed by Dr. Phyllis Lan Lin's Breaking the Glass Ceiling, Diversity and Inclusion from local China time 10:30 to noon. The afternoon by Mr. Han Mei Ching, Cultural Engines for Global Business Leadership Development from 2 to 3:15 local China time, and then following our concurrent open space with again tracks 1 through 5 at 3:30 to 5 o'clock local China time. All of that information is available both on the AODN.org website and also on your personalized link page, where you can follow session by simply clicking on the Join Link button. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Matt Minahan, who will be speaking to us about the Global OD Competency Framework. Matt Minahan is the president of MN & Associates, an international consulting firm specializing in strategy, structure, leadership development, and communications. Matt's clients are in the private and public sectors implementing enterprise-wide change programs, including business strategy, mission, business process simplification, new structures, and communication. He has worked internally for the first 15 years of his OD career, starting the OD function at the World Bank in 1990. Since 1997, he has been president of MM and Associates. Along with several colleagues gathered at an OD Network conference on large group systems in Dallas in 1995, he founded and ran the OD Network's listserv called ODNet with 12 specialized lists and over 3,500 members at its height. He attended and blogged about each of the OD Network conferences from 2001 through 2014. His reports can be found on the network's website. He is a former chair of the Board of Trustees of the OD Network, an active member and volunteer for NTL Institute. He teaches in the MSOD program at American University and is a guest lecturer at Benedictine University, Cabrini St. Thomas, and other universities. He presents at regional, national, and international conferences and has published numerous articles in OD networking publications, including the OD Practitioner, the OD Review, Practicing and Seasonings. He is a contributing editor to the OD Network's Handbook for Strategic HR and has contributed chapters to several OD books. We are thrilled to have Dr. Matt Minahan with us today to educate us on the Global OD Competency Framework. Dr. Minahan, I turn it over to you as the presenter to share your knowledge and wisdoms with us.
Very well, Sunny. Thank you very much for the introduction, for the very gracious and warm introduction. And it's a pleasure to be with you this morning, this Saturday morning in China. The AODN conference here, I think, has been enormously well thought out and well designed. And I hope that you find today's work, both my session and also Dr. Phyllis Lin's session, to be useful and helpful to you as well. The title for what we're going to work on here today is called How to Work as an Effective OD Practitioner. And I'm going to share with you the Global OD Competency Model because it is very recently done, and I'll explain some of the methodology we used to develop it. And in the end, this describes the elements of OD jobs and the skills that OD practitioners need to have in order to do the work. Just a word of caution here. What you're going to see is rather daunting. What you're going to see is a bit overwhelming because these are advanced skills that are expected of an OD practitioner with 10 or 15 years of experience. They're not easy to access when you're just entering the field. They're not easy to access when you are working in HR and trying to expand into OD. So when we walk through these competencies, my hope is that you are not overwhelmed or you're not depressed by what you see, because these are fairly advanced competencies. What I'll do with each set of competencies is stop the presentation and we'll talk about how you can gain these skills, how you can move from an HR specialist to an OD specialist, and some ways that you can gain these skills so that you can advance your career and so that you can have a larger impact on the world, on your organization, on yourself, and on the world. So let me just start with where I'm coming from here. I want to share with you my mission. So everything that I do, all the work that I do, is to reduce the gap between the human potential and human condition in order to build healthy communities and a better world for all. And in some ways, the gap feels as large as it looks in this picture. From across a big valley, and we feel very small and insignificant, as do the people on the left-hand plateau. However, that gap is not as large as that. And as long as each of us is making steps toward our human potential, as long as each of us is working to advance ourselves, as long as each of us is looking to expand our capacity, then that gap reduces between the human condition and human potential. And that's my mission, is to help us all close that gap between the human condition and human potential. So let's talk about a competency. What is a competency? A competency is the knowledge that enables a person to complete a task. Okay, so what do I have to know in order to do OD? What kinds of things do I have to know and be able to do in order to effectively do the projects and the tasks that we talk about in OD? Yesterday, when I introduced myself, I described the work that we do in our organization. We do long-term projects on strategy, on structure, on business process reengineering, on leadership development, and on culture change. These are long-form 2, 3, 4-year projects, some even longer than that. And we are working at these highest levels of complexity in OD only after 40 years of work at it. I got my start doing team building sessions. I got my start at the World Bank doing country development workshops between our World Bank teams in China and between your government teams in China and in Mozambique and in South Africa and in countries all around the world. And so it is not reasonable for a career to begin in strategy, structure, business process, and culture change. It is reasonable for a career to begin with team building. And once you have experience with team building, maybe a little data collection and some focus groups and maybe some action research, then the skills build on each other from project to project to project to project, and you increase your capacity to do this kind of work. So the competency is the knowledge that enables a person to complete a task. So what else do we want to know about a competency? Well, first of all, there are characteristics or labels that describe workplace behaviors. They're the way that we enact the organization's strategies and goals and values and culture. By declaring a set of competencies, the organization is saying, this is the way we want to be. By declaring a set of competencies, the organization is saying, we want to accomplish these goals in the OD function. These are the values that we hold in the OD function. And this is the culture of the organization we want to move to. Competencies are also very helpful in understanding the variability in job performance, not just in OD, but in every job family. Our list of competencies helps us understand who is performing well on the competencies and who is not performing as well on the competencies. And unless we have the list of competencies, she needs to be able to type at this speed. He needs to be able to deliver packages, this many packages in an hour. Unless we have competencies at that level, we don't have the capacity to say, this person is doing it really well, and this person is not doing it really well. So competencies help us account for substantial variability in job performance. Ideally, we want our competencies to be measurable, observable, and malleable or changeable or flexible so that they can adapt over time. We want our competencies to be transferable across a wide range of occupations and organizational levels. If you develop these OD competencies, you should be able to work in OD jobs, in planning jobs, in strategy jobs, in management jobs, in leadership jobs. And so these competencies should contribute to your career advancement in multiple disciplines. And finally, competencies are often explained in a dictionary or a model that is tailored to your organization. So those are some attributes of competencies that I want us all to be aware of. So before we get any farther, I'd like to hear from you. Does your organization use competencies, not just OD competencies or any competencies? If you could raise your hand, maybe Sunny could help count who or how many hands we see. Do you have competencies in your organization? And just raise your hand on the screen.
We have several hands raised, and I believe others still navigating towards the hand raising function. And that function in the GoToWebinar is on your platform next to your name to be able to select the hand raise function.
All right, so while people are thinking about that and answering, I'm going to ask you to write into the chat function an answer to this question. And that is, how does your organization use competencies? For promotion, for recruiting, for job evaluation, for development, for performance feedback, for compensation? So take a moment and again, think about an answer in the chat box for your organizations that are using competencies. Write to all of us, and Sunny will read us the answers. Write to all of us and let us know how your organizations are using competencies. And as I said, some examples are for planning, for recruiting, for career development, for job analysis, for performance feedback, for training and development. Those are all ways that competencies can be used.
Ms. Supreme Sma says usually for training and development, and
Okay.
Other comments regarding transformation on the whole.
Good. Others?
We have multiple comments rolling in. Ms. Hu Yi says recruiting, training, performance feedback, talent review and succession planning are other comments.
Good.
Reinforcing the recruiting portion again, other comments.
So you can see that there are multiple ways that you can use competencies in your organization. Once it takes some work to develop a set of competencies, but once you have it, they can apply to the full range of the employee life cycle, beginning with recruitment and placement and development and training and career advancement and job analysis and performance management and performance feedback and promotion criteria. Once you have a set of competencies, and it sounds like many of your organizations have them, but it sounds like many of yours don't. Once you have them, when they are fully utilized, they can support the full range of HR functions, and you want to take advantage of them. What we're going to talk about today in terms of OD competencies are much more narrow. They're not the kind of thing you would apply organization-wide. They're the kind of thing you would apply to the OD function, which is typically pretty small in most organizations. But if you have clarity about what the OD competencies are, then you have the framework to be able to do the job to its fullest. And that's what we want to spend some time on here today. Sunny, are there any other comments that you want to pass along?
Yes, quite an interesting one, Matt. One regarding competencies in support of performing managerial tasks.
Yes, I can see that. Yes, an organization that has a good set of competencies includes managerial competencies, which explain the key elements of the manager's job and the standards to which they have to perform them. So that is a very good application of the competency model. And there are not many organizations that have done that. And it sounds like there's at least one here that has. So that's really cool. That's great. Any other comments, Sunny?
Not at this point. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks very much. So we've talked about the kinds of problems that competencies can solve, and we just talked about how many uses you already have for them. Training, development, recruitment. So we've already covered a lot of the answers to these questions. So why do we need competencies? So at the center of the circle here, competencies are the common language that we use in talking about job performance. And we can use them in the far left-hand side for recruitment and selection. We can use them for development. We can use them for classification and compensation setting. We can use them for performance management. We can also establish competencies as is. In other words, what is the snapshot of our organization competencies today? Or we can set them for the future and say, in 3 years, once we've finished our training program, or in 5 years, once we've re-recruited people in the analytics department, or in 2 years, once we've restaffed the IT platform. These are the competencies we want in the future. And so when you think of the competencies, either now or in the future, they can drive your training program because you need to develop skills into the future that you don't currently have now. They can also drive your recruitment platform because we know we're going to need a specialization in a particular area in 2 years. So we can start recruiting for it now. And so we use competencies both as a snapshot of the present, but also as a prediction or a goal that we want to set for the future. So here's a second question I want to hear from as many of you as possible. Does your organization have competencies in the OD function? I'm imagining some of you are already in the OD function and don't have competencies. I'm imagining most of your organizations don't yet have an OD function and therefore don't have competencies. But take a moment and think about, does your organization have competencies for its OD function? And if so, please raise your hand. So I said very few, in my experience, very few of the organizations in China have an explicit OD function. But if any of you come from organizations that have an OD function, and you use competencies, raise your hand. And
Key
Sunny,
insight,
I'm imagining there are only
no organizations thus far.
I'm sorry?
I apologize. Key insight, Matt, no organizations thus far, no hands raised.
Right, that would be my hunch. So that's a good starting point for us. So we're really starting at ground zero here. And I'm betting that there will be lots of opportunity for personal and professional development for our participants here by virtue of what we talk about in today's session. So I want to share with you the Global OD Network Competency Framework, and that's this model here. Let me tell you a little bit about where it comes from. The model is developed into 5 sections, and I'll describe each of the 5 sections in just a moment. Let me tell you how we derived this model. So several years ago, we were thinking, how do we discover what competencies OD people have? And so we formed an advisory panel, and we asked that panel, who are exemplars in our field? Who are the people who do OD really well? These were mostly internal OD people. And so we arranged to interview 25 internal OD people. And we asked them, what's your job and how do you do it? And what are the elements of your job? We then talked to their bosses, and we asked their bosses, what's the work that you have your OD person doing? How are they doing it? And what stands out for you in the way they do their work? So from these 50 interviews, 25 with OD people and 25 with their bosses, we started to pull out some behavior statements, and we started to pull out some actions that these exemplars were taking. From there, we started to organize them into a framework. And we went back to our exemplars and we went back to their bosses and we said, does this framework look about right to you? And we got feedback from them on what they gave us, and we organized it again. And then we sent this out on a survey to OD practitioners all over the world. And we said, give us your feedback on these topics as well. And we had 890 people respond to our survey with feedback on the model. And with that, we started then to craft what you're going to see here. So as you can see, we had a very rigorous and very intentional process and methodology for creating this model. There are 5 elements to the model. First, systems change expert. You need to have some knowledge and some capacity in how a system operates and what we need to do to make the system change. The second is efficient designer. You need to be able to create actions, create meetings, create events that efficiently accomplish the organization's goals. Third, you need to be a business advisor. You need to be someone who can be trusted by the senior management. You need to be someone who is engaged with the senior management and someone whose advice is sought and taken by senior management. You need to be a credible strategist. That is, someone who is believed, someone whose word makes a difference, and someone who makes good choices about how to get things done. And then finally, you need to be an informed consultant. You need to have some basic skills in the consulting model: how to enter, how to collect data, how to feedback data, what to do with data, how to move the organization from data to action. And those are all skills embedded here under informed consultant. So my plan here is to spend about 10 minutes on each of these 5 areas. I want to show you what's underneath of these 5 areas, and then invite you to ask any questions you might have in each of the 5 areas before we move on. So let's take a look at the first area. Which is efficient designer. So this is kind of the beginning of the model. There are 3 competencies broadly under efficient designer. 1 is you need to be efficient at designing things. 2, you need to have be a good process consultant, and 3, you need to be a good data synthesizer. So an efficient designer strives for simplicity, does things simply, designs processes to facilitate a desired result with the client and end user in mind. So a lot of what we do in OD is project management, and meeting facilitation. And so when I'm designing an intervention, I want to make it as efficient as possible to achieve the result. When I'm designing a meeting in an intervention, I want the design to be simple to achieve the desired result. So for example, if here's an example from a consulting project I did. We had an organization that had 35 people on the leadership team. So I said to the director, I said, yes, but I mean, who's the inner leadership team? Who do you really rely on? And he said, well, it's all 35. And I said, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Can you help me understand why your leadership team is so large? And he told me the story. I said to him later, how do you get anything done? If you're consulting with 35 people, how do you get anything done and accomplish anything? Oops, our slide got advanced here. Sorry. Let me move back here. How do you get anything done? And so he said, I need a smaller leadership team. So we created a benchmarking process by which the organization would go out and talk to other organizations, similar organizations. Let me let the captioning catch up with me here. There we go. Yeah, so I think we got frozen for a minute and hopefully we're back again. So I had to design an efficient process that would enable these 35 leaders to go out and ask questions of other similar organizations with engineers and scientists and astronomers about how they had their meetings and how many people are on their leadership teams. So I had to design the process, and then I had to design the meeting by which they all came back and reported out their results. And the good news is that they all concluded that 35 people on the leadership team was too large and that they needed 7 or 8 in order to get anything done. Now, that's exactly what the director wanted, but he didn't have to say, I want 7 or 8 people and I'm going to throw 27 of you off of the leadership team. By virtue of designing this benchmarking process, the organization was able to make this change, and the leadership team came to this conclusion themselves. So that's an example of being an efficient designer, creating structures and processes that help to achieve the work. A process consultant helps to increase leadership and organization capacity by facilitating group dialogue and decision-making and creating a non-threatening environment. So one of the hardest things for organizations to do is to make decisions. And many OD people don't have good skills in facilitating group decision-making. Many OD people love to brainstorm. They love to create new ideas, but we're not really good at eliminating ideas and getting down to the one selection. Getting good at decision-making and getting good at facilitating meetings is one good way to support your clients and to become a better process consultant. And finally, the third competency under efficient designer is data synthesizer. So this is a person who is able to integrate and connect data from multiple perspectives, from stakeholders and managers and staff and customers, and translate that into clarity and commitment. So those are the three elements of efficient designer, process consultant, and data synthesizer. So I'm going to pause here and give you, I don't know, a minute and a half or 2 minutes to review what I've said and to type into the chat box any questions you might have about doing this work, any questions you might have about how to be an efficient designer or process consultant or data synthesizer. So
Matt, we have one.
Yes, go ahead.
Apologies. We do have one question already available.
Okay.
From an efficient designer perspective, it is usually not clearly defined to the staff what the competencies are needed from an organization's perspective. We feel that the expectation is there, but how should organizations communicate the need? And also, how should individuals that have that capacity and capability take the initiative to identify this is needed and how to participate?
So there are multiple questions in there, and they're all good ones, Sunny. When organizations don't have a competency framework in place, it is worth it to invest the effort. And most organizations hire an HR consulting firm to do some job analysis and create the competency framework. With that work typically comes a communication strategy that the HR consulting firm creates to help inform staff and managers about why this is important and about how it will be used. So typically competency projects are too big for an internal HR or OD person to do by themselves, or even an HR or OD department. So typically you rely upon a consulting firm for that kind of input.
Questions are rolling in.
Good. Pass it along, Sunny.
So another question is, in consideration of the efficient designer, what is the difference between designing the process versus consulting the process?
Right. So this is, those of you who were with us yesterday, I said that the hardest thing you're going to have to do here in your work in China is to educate your clients that what they're hiring you for is not to tell them what the answer is, but to help the organization discover the answer that is best for itself. I said that yesterday, I just said it, and I'm going to say it again. The hardest thing you're going to have to do as an OD person is to educate your clients that you are not coming as a consultant who's going to tell them the answer. You're coming as a consultant who's going to help their people discover the right answer. And so an efficient designer creates a project plan, creates processes, creates methods that enable the members of the organization to solve their problems, to define their problems and identify possible solutions and make decisions. So an efficient designer does project design, does project management, does meeting design, does meeting facilitation, and meeting management. I hope that gets to your question. You had others, Sunny?
Yes, in Efficient Designer, there are 3 titles listed. What, in your opinion, is the top competency under this section?
Yeah, I can't choose. They're all indispensable. An efficient designer needs to strive for simplicity, needs to be able to create organizational capacity by intervening at the process level, and needs to be able to take data from multiple sources and make it make sense. So it's hard to pick one.
Great promotion of all of the needs and roles. There's a question regarding how to facilitate conclusive decision making. It's easier to facilitate brainstorming and creative thinking than to come to conclusive decision making. What would you recommend on how to get teams to that end output?
That's an excellent question. That was the topic for my dissertation research, was on group decision making. And in the end, there are only a couple of ways for a group to make a decision. One is by consensus, one is by vote, and one is managerial decision. So there are only 3 ways for groups to make a decision. One is by consensus. Let me talk about consensus. Consensus doesn't mean we all agree. Consensus means I can live with that solution. So we always want to strive for consensus because we want to make sure we hear all of the voices. And we want to make sure we account for all of the voices that we've heard. But consensus is, it's not my favorite solution. It's not the best solution in my opinion, but I can live with it. So consensus first. Second is vote. Let's go around the table. Who's in favor of option A? Please raise your hand. Who's in favor of option B? Please raise your hand. So second is by vote. And then the third is the manager decides. So the manager listens, hears all the arguments, might even strive for consensus, might even want to ask for a vote, but the manager retains for herself or himself the option of making the decision themselves. So that's really all you need to know. There's one, in terms of decision methods, there is one other thing I'll just tell you about now, and that has to do with developing criteria. Every time we make a decision about anything, there are criteria involved. Most of the time, we're not even aware of the criteria. Most of the time, they're not explicit. But the decision to get out of bed this morning and attend this session, you had to have some criteria. I've already paid for it. It's already a commitment. My boss is expecting it. It will help me advance my career, whatever they happen to be. Those are all decision criteria. And if they didn't make any difference to you, if those criteria were irrelevant, you would not be on this session right now. Well, the same is true for groups as well. When groups start to brainstorm, they start to diverge, they start to create possibilities, at some point, they have to shift out of creativity and into decision. They have to shift out of divergence, expanding possibilities, and into convergence or reducing possibilities. And working the second half, the convergence half, is really the application of criteria. Most groups have a hard time having the conversation about criteria, but as you get good at your process consultation skills, you'll start to hear the criteria come out. When someone says, gee, I don't think we ought to be doing option A because it's going to be too expensive. Aha, cost is a criterion. And so you go to the whiteboard and you write down cost. And somebody says, yeah, but we just don't have the talent to do option B. Aha, so you write down, do we have the talent? And so as people start to talk about the options, they start to develop the criteria that eventually they're going to use to pick the one solution. And our job as process consultants is to listen to what they're saying, keep track of what it is, validate what we've heard. So you're saying that the cost is a factor here? Oh yeah, everybody agrees. Okay, fine, check. So you're saying that you're concerned we don't have the talent or the capacity? Yeah, okay, fine, check. So those are the key things about working the convergence side of that. 3 decision methods: consensus, vote, manager makes the decision, and then making the criteria explicit so the group can see what they're actually deciding against. That was a long answer, Sunny, sorry.
Excellent feedback. I think some of the hands raised were intended to be applause mechanism.
Okay, good. That's great. Do we have time for one more question? I think we can take one more, if there is one.
When you look at efficient designer, there's so much speaking towards essentially like a technical capability, an industrial engineer, and some very specialized functions. How do we move from specialized functions into actual OD efficient designer, and where are the interplays there?
So efficient designer here is an OD function, okay? Because what we're interested in doing is designing the project and the meeting so it's efficient. I don't want to bring a bunch of managers together around a table to have a meeting to discuss data without encouraging them to make a decision about what to do. That's efficiency. So I'm being efficient at designing the OD process. I'm being efficient at designing the meeting so that it makes the best use of the participants' time to facilitate a desired result with the client and the end user in mind. That's what we want to do. We want to facilitate the desired result with the client and the end user in mind. So you're right, this does sound a bit like industrial engineering, but we're applying those kind of business-oriented terms to the work that we do in OD so that you can see the close connection between what we're doing in OD and our field and the work that we do in our client systems. All right, Sunny, I'm going to move on unless you've got another big question.
No, back to you, Matt.
Okay, fine. So the second competency area is called business advisor. And there are 3 competencies under business advisor. One is strategic catalyst. So this is thinking strategically, taking initiative, acting to achieve results tied to the organization's goals. Second is results-oriented leader. This is someone an OD person, who understands and applies customer service, sets challenging goals, measures the impact of their work, and return on investment. And finally, trusted advisor. Develops trusting relationships and partnerships through integrity and authenticity, and is clear about the outcomes that are important to key stakeholders. So, a strategic catalyst, in very concrete terms, is someone who is proactive. They don't wait to be told something. They're anticipating what needs to be done. They're looking at the organization's goals. They're looking at the organization's results, and they're thinking independently about what can we do to make it better. So this is a catalyst for change. This is someone who is anticipating business problems and is proposing to their leadership solutions, or at least processes, to address those business problems. The results-oriented leader is someone who is very aware of the goals, measures the impact of their work, the return on investment of the OD effort, and applies the principles of customer service to the very work that we do, which should be customer-oriented. And finally, the trusted advisor is someone whose opinion is sought out and whose perspective is considered valuable by others in the organization. So let me pause here. I don't think I have any stories to tell about this, but let me pause here and invite you to write questions into the chat box. Take a couple of moments, think about what these bring to mind for you. Think about what questions come to mind.
A philosophical question. Would the word advisor be contradictory to the intention that OD consultants should not advise businesses what to do?
I don't think it's contradictory. For me, we're not advising the business what to do. We're developing trusting relationships and partners and relationships and partnerships through authenticity. And we're very clear about what our role is and what the manager's role is. So we're advising not on business strategy, not on what the organization ought to be doing, but we're advising on possible actions. We're advising on best practices. We're advising on alternatives and options. And I really want to underline the trusted part, because the trusted part is the most important part in this competency. That means people in the system know me. They know who I am. They know what I'm good at. They know that I get things done, and they come to me through integrity and authenticity because I am clear about the outcomes and I am clear about what's important for key stakeholders. Questions in the chat box?
Yes, Matt. Could you expand upon the importance of building trust with the client and how to go about doing that?
Sure. Good, very good question. When we do this kind of work, we're asking the client to put their organization in our hands. We're asking the client to turn over their people and turn over their time to our project and our leadership and our facilitation. And so if I'm a busy finance manager and the OD person comes to talk to me about trying to solve a problem in the accounts payable department, I've got to trust that you, the OD person, know what you're talking about and are not going to waste the time of my people. So when I bring you in as the OD consultant, I, the finance manager, am putting myself on the line by endorsing you and saying, Sunny's coming in here to do some work for us. She's going to be working with you for the next 2 or 3 months, trying to figure out why we have problems in the accounting function. She's not going to tell us what the answer is. Sunny is going to work with you so that you can decide together what the problems are and what the answers are. And for me as a manager to say that, I have to have a high degree of trust in Sunny in order to make this a useful use of time for my people and for their time. So how to build trust? Trust is something that we build in slow approximations. So having a reputation internally for something is the best way to build trust. Everybody knows that Sunny is our best person to solve team problems. Everybody knows that Sunny solved the problem of the production line by virtue of talking to the people on the production line. Sunny didn't tell them the answer, she talked to the people and they came up with the answer. Everybody knows that Sunny helped the recruiting team solve the IT recruiting problem, not because Sunny knows IT recruiting, but because she was able to get the IT recruiters to have that conversation. And so that's how you build trust. You have a reputation. You get to be known for taking on difficult problems and helping work groups find their own solutions for them. think we have time probably for one or two other questions if you have them, Sunny.
Matt, I love that example. Thank you.
Well, listen, you're going to be our OD consultant for the rest of this session, if that's okay.
An additional question, you know, when you talk about building trust, can you talk about the confidence and the self-identity that you have to really be rigorous at and comfortable in order to facilitate such work?
This has a lot to do with use of self, and I'm sure that you heard a bit about that last night. You'll hear a lot more of it today with Dr. Phyllis when she talks about the glass ceiling. But use of self is the way we speak, act, use our body, use our mind, use our heart in order to be in relationship with someone else. And we do this instinctively with our lovers, with our partners, with our spouses. We do this instinctively with our parents, with our children, with our friends. We don't have to think about it then. But when we're doing this in the workplace, and my results are a function of our relationship, I have to be thoughtful and mindful about how I show up. I have to be thoughtful and mindful about what I say and how I say it. I have to be thoughtful and mindful about holding confidences. I have to be thoughtful and mindful about self-disclosure. How much of my life am I going to share with the client? What is that boundary between personal and professional? I don't want to cross the personal professional boundary with my client. And so by showing up with integrity, by telling the truth, by honoring the client's boundaries, those are all ways in which I can build trust with my clients. All right, I'm going to suggest we move on. We have 3 more of these. So the next competency we have is called credible strategist. And there are 3 competencies here under credible strategist. The first is called credible influencer. And this is someone who can empathetically relate to the client and understands their needs and has the knowledge to translate the business. So this is someone who has empathy. This is someone who can put themselves in another person's shoes. This is someone who understands the client needs or even the customer's needs, not just the internal client, but the customer's needs and the impact that they have and how that translates into the business. So a lot of us get trapped internally in the jobs that we're doing, and we get bounded by whatever today's requirements are for the job. And so we lose sight of important variables like, what do our sales look like this month? Or what do our finances look like this month? Or what are our customers saying about us? Or what are the customer satisfaction surveys saying about us? And so just as we talked about, the strategic catalyst is an earlier competency. They're looking beyond their job. They're looking at the business as a whole. The credible influencer is looking at outside at the client, outside at the customer, and trying to anticipate the customer's needs and translating that into language that the business can understand. The second one, the collaborative communicator, that's this one here, communicates clearly and concisely and tailors communication in a way that meets the needs and motivations of client groups at all levels. So this is someone who can speak multiple languages. They may all be Chinese, they may all be English, but the multiple languages that they speak are the languages of the customer, the languages of the various departments within the organization, and we call them a boundary spanner. That is, they can stand across 2 boundaries and help the people on one side of the boundary communicate with people on the other side of the boundary. And so this is someone who has enough knowledge about both to be able to speak the language of both and help one function communicate with another function, and helping motivate the client groups at all levels. And finally, the globally diverse integrator. This is someone who's able to effectively work and within diverse cultures, creating an inclusive environment for people of all identities to feel valued, respected, and able to contribute. So this is someone, particularly those of you who work in multinational organizations, where you have a China component and you have an Asia component and you have a Europe component and you have a Latin America component. The globally diverse integrator is able to understand those cultural competencies and to be able to work across the multiple cultures, across diverse cultures, so that you're creating one inclusive environment that brings together the best of all of those cultures. If you're not working in a multinational company, but you're working internally in a China company, you don't need to be working across continents. You can be working across work group cultures. You can be working across finance and marketing and production and HR and research and R&D. Those are islands of culture. And a good OD person is able to integrate across those diversities so that we can be effective in all of those areas and help all of those areas communicate with each other. So I'm trying to think of a story I could tell you about this. Yes, so here's a good example. So I worked on a project some years back for the communications department with an astronomy research lab. And there were 33 people in the communications function. And they had some people who were doing education in schools, and some people who were doing press releases, and some people who were doing presentations at conferences, and some people who were doing displays in museums. So they had 5 or 6 different functions. And each of them was unique and had unique skills, and they worked very much independently. But the problem was that the demand for some was very high, and the demand for others was very low. But they had no way to shift people from places of low demand to high demand. So these people here were very, very busy, while these people here were not busy at all. But they didn't have the language and they didn't have the skills to be able to work across these distances so that they could even out the workload. So the first thing we did when my team went in is to conduct a little communication survey and a little skills inventory to try to map where the skills were. And then we brought the 4 or 5 functions together to explain to each other what their jobs were and what their skills were. And once they had that conversation, they were able to then see how someone in this function could use some skills from someone in this function to help with the workload where the workload is the highest and help to reduce some of the stress. So by virtue of the fact that we were integrating across different cultures and we were working to communicate, to create communications to help the different client groups understand, we were able to, then we had to do one other thing, and that is we had to create incentives for these people who were taking it pretty easy to give up their easy lives and work harder for the people who had more work to do. And once we did that, the problem solved itself. So I hope that gives you an example of what it is like to work in this space on these 2 competencies. So let's pause here. I'd like to hear your questions on this. I'd like to hear what comes to mind for you on this. You might give some thought to what your questions are. And while you're thinking about them, once you have them, put them in the chat box and we can talk about them all together.
Matt, initial question.
Yep.
When we think about the impact of travel and being in places to drive that credible strategist, interacting with people and firsthand observing their cultures and behaviors, now in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic, what are tools and applications or behaviors that you would recommend on how to continue to do this, but doing it virtually and observing those things that we would otherwise see first person?
That's a really good question. First thing I would say is get familiar with a good cross-cultural model. There are two very good cross-cultural models out there. Either one of them will help you very well. They are both done by Dutch researchers. One researcher, his last name is Hofstede. I'll spell that for you. It's H-O-F as in Frank, S as in Sam, T-E-D-E. Hofstede. Geert Hofstede has a 5-factor model that helps explain cross-cultural behavior around things like power and distance and masculinity and femininity and focus on time and a couple of other variables. So that's one. I would say any of his articles would give you a good understanding of at least the basics of how to understand what's going on in other cultures. The other one is named Trompenaars, Trompenaars, Trompenaars. Boy, the captioning spelled it exactly right. He too has a really good cross-cultural model and helps to explain some of the global differences across regional cultures. So those are really good places to get started. But a third thing I would consider doing is I would consider some interviews. You know, if you're working internally and suddenly now you've got to start working with the team in Australia, I would consider talking to the team in Australia and asking them what life is like in Australia and asking them what it's like to work in their part of the organization, and let them ask you what it's like to work in your part of the organization. So a third, you know, once you have a theory base in front of you, something like interviews like that would go a long way in helping you and others understand each other.
Matt, you really struck upon the curiosity about other people and curiosity about different cultures. There is reminded of Ed Schein saying that CEO is culture. What is your interpretation of what Schein said in the context of this competency model?
Yeah, I don't, I mean, I love the man. I love his work. I think his book, Helping, is incredible. And the book after Helping is also excellent. But what he's doing is, I think he's giving too much power to the CEO in terms of creating culture. And what he's not accounting for is the passage of time. You know, a CEO in an organization for 2 years can't change much of anything. A CEO in an organization for 4 years might start to make a dent in culture. A CEO in an organization for 6 or 8 years can really drive the culture. But that's really corporate culture more than global culture. And you know, one of the things we know about multinational firms is that they are the accumulation of different regional cultures. And so General Motors in Turkey is the same company, but quite a different culture from General Motors in South Africa, which is quite a different culture, even though it's the same company as General Motors in Brazil. So culture being such a such a behavioral social sciences term. It has much less to do with who the CEO is and much more to do about the intersection of the local culture with the institutional obligations or institutional requirements of that organization. So participants, I'm hoping you've got some questions here. We'll allow another minute here for you to think about them. And while you think about them, I'll see if I can tell another story. So yes, I'll tell you a story. So on Credible Influencer, I got hired to be an executive coach, which I don't do a lot of, and frankly, I don't do very well. But I got hired to be an executive coach for one of the directors of one of the institutes at our National Institute of Health here in the US. There are 27 institutes, and I was coaching the executive in one of them. And boy, I was listening to him talk about all of the problems in the system. But as a coach, I didn't feel like I could tell him what to do. I didn't feel like I could give him guidance and make suggestions about some solutions here, because the role of a coach is to really help the client discover their own solutions. But he wasn't. And he wasn't because I'm not that good a coach, but also he wasn't because he just didn't know how to do it. So we finished our contract. The end of the 12th month came. I said, Dr. Insel, this is our last time together. This is our last session. He said, well, I would like to continue. Please, can we extend your contract? And I said, no. I said, I'm not as a coach. I said, if you want to have me around here, I'm going to fire myself as your coach. And I want you to hire me as a consultant. And he said, well, what do you mean by that? I said, here's some things that you need to think about doing. You need to think about reorganizing your own office. You need to think about getting these two research departments to talk to one another. You need to think about consolidating your communications functions across all of these different components so that they can be strengthened together. So I was inviting him to think about solutions that had come up during our coaching time, but that I didn't feel like I could recommend because I was in the coaching frame. But as soon as he invited me into the consultant frame, we had enough empathetic relationship. I had enough of an understanding of his needs, and I had the knowledge to translate them into business solutions that helped, that really guided the next 4 years of work in that institute. So that's a good example of how to be credible and influence your client in the right way. So, Sunny, have any questions come in?
Yes, a good friend of yours, Maggie Shreve from Chicago, writes.
Oh, Maggie, hello.
She would argue that bad behaviors by a CEO can radically change a culture into a hostile workplace incredibly quickly. What are your thoughts on that?
You are absolutely right, Maggie. That's exactly right. I had not considered bad behaviors. I was only considering positive behaviors. But you're right. Abusive language, abusive behavior, autocratic behavior, autocratic decision-making can cause all of those elements of a culture to change rapidly and absolutely in the wrong direction. So thank you for pointing that out and bringing that up for us. And it's good to glad to know that you're on the line here. That's great. Any other?
Yes, an excellent tactical question from Felicia. What kind of development must be put in place to achieve maximum performance in the context of the employees at her organization are 50 years old or older? How do we convince managers that they need to develop to survive this changing era?
The best argument is the business results. And if your organization is comfortably getting business results that don't cause it any pain, it's going to be a very hard argument, Felicia. The best argument is, hey, fellows, we're in trouble. Hey, folks, we're not getting results. Hey, folks, we're starting to fail in certain areas. Hey, folks, our quality is going down. Our costs are going up. Hey, folks, our profits are going down. When you have a driver like that, it is very much easier to persuade a manager to invest in her people or his people. Without that, it's a very hard slog. All right, so yeah, go ahead.
Additional question regarding the strategy of how to design strategy and when to do change strategy.
So just read the question again, Sunny, please.
When looking at strategy, how do you account for initial strategy design, and when there are changes needed, how do we communicate those changes?
Right. So I want to be really clear that the work that I think we in OD do around strategy is to create the process and the method by which the leadership in the organization discovers it and invents its own strategy. So our job here is to create the meetings, the inquiries, the interviews, the frameworks, when to use the SWOT framework, when to use another framework, and then to help manage the divergence and then the convergence that we talked about before, so that the organization can get to its strategy. There are often times when changes in strategy occur and need to be communicated well. And when that happens, I always like to return to the original strategy and say, you'll recall 2 years ago when we decided we would enter the Philippines market, and we decided we would take this product into the Philippines market. Well, here's what's happened since then. And we've since decided to change that strategy. We're no longer going to place just that product in the Philippines market. We're going to place 2 other products in the Philippines market. Or we've decided that others are competing better in the Philippines market, and we're going to withdraw from the Philippines market and pursue Indonesia instead. So the best way to communicate changes in strategy, I think, begin with what was the original strategy and the rationale behind it, how the market conditions have changed in order to force us to rethink that decision, what results we've gotten so far since we made that decision, and therefore the choice that we're going to make going in a different direction. So let me pause there. We have 2 more, and I want to get you to tea in about 15 minutes. So let me share with you the last 2 sets of competencies. The informed consultant here has 3 competencies. The exemplary consultant, so this is someone who cultivates meaningful working relationships and commitments with stakeholders to affect change. The emotionally intelligent leader, that's the second one here, is someone who reads stakeholders and seeks out different perspectives and uses emotional intelligence to guide appropriate action and understands and reflects on one's own personal values and boundaries. This is about use of self that we talked about earlier. And then the lifelong learner is someone who demonstrates leadership in a specialized area of OD. That means they have the methodologies and the tools and the best practices to drive results. So there are a whole bunch listed on this website, odnetwork.org. And they include ideas and theories and concepts like appreciative inquiry and culture change and diversity and inclusion and organization design and the science of decision making and systems theory and team development. So these are all, and there are many more, areas to be expert in terms of being an informed consultant. So this is understanding, again, understanding the steps of the consulting process and how to bring meaningful working relationships and commitment to stakeholders to change. And being personally emotionally intelligent so that we can seek out different perspectives and guide appropriate action. And finally, the lifelong learner is someone who's always striving to improve themselves and improve their skills. That you are all participating in this workshop is due to the fact that you are, at this moment, a lifelong learner. You're here to acquire new skills, new insights. You're here to understand what the full OD practitioner's job is. You're here to expand your capacity. And so just the simple fact that you are here indicates that you have a commitment to learning and to expanding your capacity as an OD practitioner. So let's pause here for the moment. Let's allow you a minute or two to review what I've said here. Think about any questions you might have and pop them into the chat box. While you think about that, you may challenge the use of our word leader here, because OD consultants are not often thought as leaders, but we wanted to communicate the fact that being an OD person is a leadership role in the organization. And even though you might not have a budget and you might not have a unit and you might not have several people working for you, nonetheless, you have a role to model the kind of emotional intelligence that we expect leaders to be able to have and to show in their work. So bring your questions to the chat box, and we'll ask Sunny to share any that come forward.
There's a question regarding your own personal application, Matt. Which one do you identify with the most?
Of these three, sounds like we're talking about these three.
Yes.
But that's really hard. You know, it's hard to pick one because, first of all, even though they look like three different ones, I think they're all the same. And, you know, I don't think I could do my job if I weren't all three. You know, I don't think if I weren't a lifelong learner, always curious about expanding my capacity, and if I didn't have a pretty good sense of how to reflect my own personal values and boundaries and feelings and biases and triggers and ethics, then I wouldn't be able to do this kind of work as an exemplary consultant. So I think it's really hard to pick one over any of these, and but I think it is quite likely that each of us has one that we feel most comfortable with now. And that is a really good starting point. That is a really good starting point. As you look at all 15 of these competencies, you'll see that they're very advanced. They demand a lot. But the truth is that you already have competency, you already have capacity in some of these already. And those are really good starting points for you to then intentionally start to build on some of the other competencies where you haven't yet reached.
There have been several validating comments, but no further questions.
Okay, that's great. So we'll move on to the last one here, which is systems change. Systems change expert. Wonder where systems change. There we go. Sorry. Systems change expert. So this has three components to it. It's about being, again, a leader around systems change, to be able to work with a whole system and advise on strategies for organizational change. It's around being a culture builder, someone who can foster commitment and engagement and trust and promote the health and vitality of the organization. And someone who's an innovator, who can sponsor and develop and is able to challenge the organization and create strategies for disruption. So this one right here is closest to the work that I think all of us do in our day-to-day jobs, no matter what function we're in, no matter whether we're in HR or finance or IT or any other function. We have to be able to understand how systems work and understand the interaction of the whole system with the parts. If we're not effective at fostering commitment and building engagement and trust and promoting health and vitality, then we're not going to be effective in the system. And finally, innovators help sponsor and develop and challenge the organization to create strategies for disruption and breakthroughs and transformation. One of the things they used to tell me when I was internal at the World Bank for 15 years. And one of the things they used to say is, if you're not willing to be fired every day that you walk into the job, then you're not doing your job well enough. You're not pushing the system to its limits. And I would say the same is true of me having my own consulting company. There have been many times when I have been willing to fire the client and walk away from the work because the client was not cooperating, because the client had told me one thing and the reality was quite different, because it was clear the organization was not interested in the changes or wasn't committed to doing the actual work. And so there's been only really one time I've actually fired the client, but there have been several times I've threatened to fire the client. I've gone in and said to the client, hey, this is not working for me. And even if it's working for you, we need to come up with a better solution. And typically that conversation has shifted the relationship, and we've gotten to a level of truth telling. We've gotten to a level of honesty that hadn't occurred before. And so I start to discover things like, well, your steering committee isn't happy with the way you handled last week's meeting. Okay, that's helpful. Or people are starting to lose interest because this is taking so long. Okay, that's really helpful, thank you. Or our budget is now constrained and we can't afford to continue with the project. Okay, that's really helpful. So being able to challenge the system and being prepared to walk away from it is an important feature of doing this work. So let me pause there, give you a moment or two to develop any questions you have. And while you do that, I want to just spend our last couple of minutes returning to the topic that we began with, and that is making the case for OD. How, as an HR person, or how, as a finance or IT person, can you make the case for OD in your organization? And what, how can you position OD to differentiate it and us from traditional expert consulting? Okay. When managers think about hiring a consultant, they think we're going to, bring someone in who's going to tell us to change this piece of machinery for that piece of machinery. They're going to give us a technical answer, or they're going to tell us to change our accounting software from this to that, or they're going to tell us that we need to decentralize. And all of those are technical solutions to business problems that our leaders and managers expect to get from consultants. And yet we offer none of those things. We have no expertise in decentralizing from here to there. We have no expertise in what software to bring into the IT department. We have no expertise in changing the accounting function. What we do have expertise in is bringing groups of people together to define a problem, to explore its parameters, to develop solutions, and to make decisions. That's our expertise. And so that's a very hard sale. It's in part education and it's in part sales in order to persuade an organization to go there with you. So the question that I think I would put to you as aspiring OD practitioners is, how can you make the case in your organization for hiring this kind of consultant who is not really a kind of consultant, for hiring a consultant who's not going to solve my IT software problem, for hiring a consultant who's not going to give me a decentralization solution, for hiring a consultant who's not going to tell me what part I need on this machine on the assembly line. Because that's the big challenge, is helping particularly small to medium-sized businesses where the leadership is very busy and very stretched, where the leadership has a very narrow focus on finances and sales and numbers. How do we persuade them to expand their focus and to include in their conversations variables like morale and employee engagement and employee commitment? Because those are the variables on which our OD interventions revolve. Those are the variables. Those are the ways we can help organizations, is to improve working conditions, improve morale, improve performance, improve employee commitment, improve the way the work gets done. And very busy CEOs, the many that I've met there in China, have a very hard time hearing that and a very hard time committing scarce resources to a consultant who's not going to fix the machine or change the software or tell them how to decentralize. So I think that's your biggest challenge. And I'd be curious to know in our last couple of moments if you have any final questions. Put them into the chat box, please, and I'll be glad to address them. We have about 3 minutes before you're scheduled for a tea break.
At the start, we had several questions, but you very efficiently answered each of them. Perhaps, Matt, you could help us with, specifically and tactically, if you are a leader of a team right now and you have the willingness to develop OD competencies, what is the first step? How do we start?
So the first step is going to be this step right here. And that is conduct a self-assessment. Go through these 15 competencies and give yourself a low, medium, high, or put it on a number scale. And then have a conversation with a colleague. If we were sitting in a conference room together, I would say turn to your neighbor and discuss your results with your neighbor. So the first place to start, Sunny and everyone, is to figure out where your strengths already are. As I said earlier, these are advanced competencies. They will seem quite formidable, quite daunting to people who are just entering the field. And yet, all of us have some capacity in many of these already. And so figuring out where you're already good and where you need to develop is the best way to get started. On the OD Network website, on this model, you will find development recommendations for each of the competencies. An article to read, an assessment to take, a website to go look at, a blog to explore. And so if you say, I want to particularly develop myself in a particular competency, on the OD Network website, you will find those development suggestions there. Any last questions, Sunny?
No further questions, Matt.
So I want to respect your time and get you off to your tea break here. Let me just again thank Dr. Lei Lu and thank all the organizers of the Asia OD Network. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to spend time with you today. You're going to have a great session with Dr. Phyllis Lin next after this tea break. She's going to talk about the glass ceiling. And this is an area where she's done a lot of research and a lot of writing. And I think her next session and your schedule for the rest of the day are going to be challenging, interesting, and very exciting. So good luck through the rest of the conference. Thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. And many thanks to Sunny and company for managing the technology for us and making this so seamless.
Thank you, Dr. Matt Minahan. We are going to take a 15-minute break starting at 10:15 local China time, and we will be back at 10:30 local China time. Please utilize your personalized page for your join links and click on the join session for the session on Dr. Phyllis Lin, Breaking the Glass Ceiling, Diversity and Inclusion at 10:30 local China time. Thank you.